Welcome to the Ossuary Archives. This is the story of Ned Ludlow, a resurrection man working London's graveyards in 1828, and the night he unearthed something that refused to stay buried. If you're drawn to the darker corridors of medical history, where desperation, science, and morality collided in the mud, you've found your community here. Now, let me take you to St. Pancras Churchyard on a November night when the rain fell like judgment and the dead had something to say. The rain came down in sheets that 3rd of November, turning St. Pancras Churchyard into a sucking bog that pulled at our boots with every step. I remember thinking it was perfect. The downpour would keep the watchmen inside their huts, and the mud softened easy, came away from the coffin wood without the screech of frozen earth that could wake the houses backing onto the cemetery wall. Jack Tanner walked 3 paces behind me, carrying the sacks and the shorter spade, his breath coming in nervous bursts I could hear even over the rain. The yew trees dripped black water onto the newer graves, where the mounds hadn't settled yet, and the earth still remembered the shape of what it held. I'd been opening graves for 3 years by then, since 1825 when Martha died. The drink took what little honest work I could still manage. Before that, I'd been a gravedigger at this very churchyard, knew every path, every gate that didn't latch proper, every stone that wobbled underfoot. I'd buried hundreds in my time with the spade. Now I dug them up again. The symmetry of it used to bother me, back when things still bothered me, back before the gin made everything distant and manageable, like watching your own life through gauze. "Calworth's the 3rd tonight," Jack whispered, though there was no one to hear us but the dead. "Fresh this morning. Should be easy money." He was always calculating, always counting, 8 pounds per body if it was good quality, 10 if it was very fresh, and Dr. Wick was teaching a full anatomy course. Jack had been a medical student once, before the debt and the disgrace, so he knew what the doctors wanted. Clean bodies, young bodies, bodies that still looked like people instead of the rotted things we sometimes pulled up when we misjudged the burial date. Sarah Calworth had been 24 years old, a baker's daughter, dead of scarlet fever, according to the obituary I'd read in the coffee house that morning. I always read them, the death notices, studying them like a merchant studies a ship's manifest. This one had been perfect. Young woman, sudden death, fresh grave in a churchyard I knew well, funeral that very morning with only family present so there'd be no money for a mort safe or a night watchman. The poor couldn't afford to protect their dead. I knew that better than anyone. We found her plot near the northern wall, where the graves crowded close, and the monuments were simple wood markers instead of stone angels. My spade bit into the mud with a sound like tearing meat, and I felt that old familiar emptiness settle over me, the nothing feeling I needed to do this work, the space inside where conscience used to live. Jack worked beside me faster than I was, eager to be done with it. He was always eager now, always talking about saving money, about getting out. I didn't ask where he planned to go. I'd stopped planning anything beyond the next grave, the next bottle. The rain intensified as we dug, filling the hole nearly as fast as we could empty it. My hands were numb inside my gloves, and the gin I'd drunk before we started was wearing off, letting the cold back in. 3 feet down, 4 feet. The clay gave way to the sandy soil they used to pack around the coffins. 5 feet. My spade struck wood at 2:30 in the morning. I heard the church bell toll the half hour just as the blade connected with the coffin lid. We worked faster then, scraping the mud away from the top, exposing the cheap pine box that was all Sarah Calworth's family could afford. No brass fittings, no ornamental handles, just wood and nails and a girl who'd never wake to see her wedding day. "Christ, it's cold," Jack muttered, and I heard his teeth chattering. He was always cold these days, thin as he was, burning through his youth doing this work that carved you hollow from the inside out. I'd watched him change over 3 years, watched the medical student with dreams become this nervous creature who jumped at shadows and chewed his fingernails until they bled. I wedged the iron bar under the coffin lid, finding the gap where the nails held weakest. This was the delicate part. We needed the body intact, undamaged, or Dr. Wick would dock our payment. A cracked skull, a broken limb, these reduced the educational value, as he called it. I'd learned to work carefully, methodically, treating the bodies with a strange tenderness that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with money. The first nail came free with a wet squeal. The second, Jack was breathing heavily beside me, and I could smell the fear sweat on him mixing with the rain and the mud and the faint sweet rot that always hung around fresh graves, even in November cold. Her eyes were open. That's what I'll remember until the day they put me in the ground. Her eyes wide and staring, reflecting the lantern light like pools of black water. Her mouth was open too, and there was mud on her lips, on her burial shroud, as if she'd been thrashing, fighting. Her hands were raised, fingers curled into claws, and I could see the wood splinters under her nails where she'd scratched and scratched and scratched. But she wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. The eyes were open, yes, but they had that flatness, that absence I'd seen in 200 corpses. Whatever had made the scratching sound, whatever had moaned, it was gone now, or it had never been there at all. Is she... Jack couldn't finish the question. I reached down with shaking hands and touched her throat, feeling for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. The skin was cold. Not fresh dead cold, but truly cold. Hours cold. She'd been dead when they buried her this morning. She was dead now. The scratching I'd heard was impossible. Unless she'd been in a coma. Catalepsy, the medical books called it. A death-like trance that mimicked true death so perfectly that even doctors were fooled. People leaving instructions for their jugulars to be cut before burial, for bells to be attached to their coffins, just in case. But her eyes were open. Had been open, perhaps, when they'd closed the lid. "We're taking her," I said. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, thick and distant. "Dr. Wick pays double for fresh ones." "Ned," Jack grabbed my arm. "Ned, if she was alive when they buried her..." "She's dead, Jack. Been dead for hours. Whatever I heard, it wasn't her." But even as I said it, I was remembering Martha. Remembering the day I'd tracked her stolen body to St. Thomas's Hospital, how I'd stood outside the anatomy theater and heard the medical students laughing inside. I'd started drinking that night. Never really stopped. We lifted Sarah Colworth from her coffin, wrapped her in canvas, and climbed from the grave. I felt something hard in my coat pocket, the silver button Martha had sewn on 5 years ago. I pulled it free and dropped it into the empty coffin before we shoveled the mud back in. A burial offering. We reached the cart. Jack wanted to leave immediately, but I stood there in the rain, looking back at the churchyard. Then I heard it again, faint, impossible, scratching, coming from inside the canvas sack. Jack's face went white. "No, that's not." The scratching stopped, started again. 3 deliberate sounds. My hands moved without thought, pulling at the ties. Jack tried to stop me, but I shook him off. The sack fell open, and Sarah Colworth stared up at us with those terrible open eyes. But she wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, was nothing but a corpse. "It's the rain," Jack said desperately. "Rain hitting the canvas." I wanted to believe him. But I'd been robbing graves for 3 years, and I'd never heard rain sound like fingernails on wood. Her eyes were open. That's what I'll remember until the day they put me in the ground. Her eyes wide and staring, reflecting the lantern light like pools of black water. Her mouth was open too, and there was mud on her lips, on her burial shroud, as if she'd been thrashing, fighting. Her hands were raised, fingers curled into claws, and I could see the wood splinters under her nails where she'd scratched and scratched and scratched. But she wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. The eyes were open, yes, but they had that flatness, that absence I'd seen in 200 corpses. Whatever had made the scratching sound, whatever had moaned, it was gone now, or it had never been there at all. "Is she..." Jack couldn't finish the question. I reached down with shaking hands and touched her throat, feeling for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. The skin was cold. Not fresh dead cold, but truly cold. Hours cold. She'd been dead when they buried her this morning. She was dead now. The scratching I'd heard was impossible. Unless she'd been in a coma. Catalepsy, the medical books called it. A death-like trance that mimicked true death so perfectly that even doctors were fooled. People leaving instructions for their jugulars to be cut before burial, for bells to be attached to their coffins, just in case. But her eyes were open. Had been open, perhaps, when they'd closed the lid. "We're taking her," I said. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, thick and distant. "Dr. Wick pays double for fresh ones." "Ned," Jack grabbed my arm. "Ned, if she was alive when they buried her." "She's dead, Jack. Been dead for hours. Whatever I heard, it wasn't her." But even as I said it, I was remembering Martha. Remembering the day I'd tracked her stolen body to St. Thomas's Hospital, how I'd stood outside the anatomy theater and heard the medical students laughing inside. I'd started drinking that night. Never really stopped. We lifted Sarah Callworth from her coffin, wrapped her in canvas, and climbed from the grave. I felt something hard in my coat pocket, the silver button Martha had sewn on 5 years ago. I pulled it free and dropped it into the empty coffin before we shoveled the mud back in. A burial offering. We reached the cart. Jack wanted to leave immediately, but I stood there in the rain, looking back at the churchyard. Then I heard it again. Faint, impossible, scratching, coming from inside the canvas sack. Jack's face went white. "No, that's not." The scratching stopped, started again. 3 deliberate sounds. My hands moved without thought, pulling at the ties. Jack tried to stop me, but I shook him off. The sack fell open, and Sarah Callworth stared up at us with those terrible open eyes. But she wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, was nothing but a corpse. "It's the rain," Jack said desperately. "Rain hitting the canvas." I wanted to believe him. But I'd been robbing graves for 3 years, and I'd never heard rain sound like fingernails on wood. Dr. Albert Wick's surgery stood in a narrow lane off Gray's Inn Road, wedged between a gin house and a printer's shop, unmarked except for a small brass plate that read, "Ale, Wick, Surgeon Anatomist." We arrived at 3:15 in the morning. The cart rattling over cobblestones, slick with rain and refuse, Sarah Callworth's body shifting in its canvas shroud with each jolt. Jack knocked at the back door using the agreed pattern, 3 quick raps, pause, 2 more. And we waited in the darkness while my heart hammered against my ribs in a way it hadn't done since my first resurrection 3 years ago. The door opened a crack, and I saw Wick's face in the gap, narrow and pale as a fish belly, his spectacles catching the light from somewhere inside. He never let us in, never invited us past the threshold. We did our business in the alley, in the dark, where transactions left no witnesses and no records. "Quality, gentlemen," he said in that thin voice of his, the same words every time like a prayer or a curse. "Freshness determines educational value." We hauled the body from the cart, and Jack unwrapped enough of the canvas for Wick to examine the face. The doctor leaned close, and I watched his expression. Clinical, assessing, utterly without feeling. He touched Sarah's cheek, pulled back one eyelid, checked her teeth like a man buying a horse. "Burial date?" "This morning," I said. 10 hours dead, no more." "Scarlet fever, according to the death notice," Jack added. And I shot him a look because we never volunteered information beyond what Wick asked for. The less he knew about how we chose our merchandise, the better for all of us. But Wick just nodded, still examining Sarah's hands, turning them over to look at her palms. That's when I saw him pause. His fingers traced the splinters embedded under her nails, the torn skin where she'd clawed at something. Wood fibers, pale against the darker stain of grave dirt. "Interesting," he murmured. Then, louder, 10 pounds, the usual terms. He disappeared inside and returned with a canvas bag that clinked with coins. Jack took it eagerly, but I couldn't stop watching Wick's face as he looked down at Sarah Callworth, at those open eyes that stared at nothing, at the splinters under her nails that told a story I didn't want to read. "You'll be teaching today?" I asked, though I never asked, though it was none of my business what he did with the bodies once we delivered them. Wick looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something flicker behind his spectacles. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition that I was asking a question that meant something. This afternoon, thoracic anatomy, 30 medical students, all paying 2 guineas each for the privilege of learning how the human heart fails. He paused. Why do you ask, Mr. Ludlow? He'd never used my name before. I hadn't known he knew it. No reason, I said, but my voice came out wrong, and Jack was pulling at my sleeve, wanting to leave, wanting to be away from this place and this transaction and the body that lay between us like an accusation. We left, got back in the cart. Jack counted the coins twice, then tucked the bag inside his coat. 10 pounds, he said, 5 each. That's good money, Ned. That's very good money. But I was thinking about Sarah Callworth lying on Wick's dissection table in a few hours, surrounded by medical students with their notebooks and their scalpels, and their absolute certainty that what they were cutting into had never been a person, had never had a name or a future, or anyone who loved them. I was thinking about Martha, about the day I'd stood outside St. Thomas's and heard them laughing. I need a drink, I said. Jack didn't argue. We always needed a drink after a delivery. The gin house on the corner was just opening when we arrived, the proprietor unbolting the door for the night workers and the resurrection men and the others who lived in London's dark hours. The place stank of unwashed bodies and spilled alcohol and the sour desperation that hung around establishments that never closed, that existed solely to help people forget what they'd done or seen or become. I ordered a full pint of gin and drank half of it in one swallow, feeling the burn down my throat, the warmth spreading through my chest, the blessed numbness creeping in at the edges of my thoughts. Jack nursed his drink more slowly, watching me with an expression I'd learned to ignore, concern, pity, disgust, some mixture of all three. You heard it too, I said finally, in the churchyard, the scratching. Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then I heard something. Could have been anything. Rain, rats, the coffin settling. And at the cart, when we opened the sack, we're tired, Ned. We've been working all night in the cold and the rain, digging up dead bodies for money. The mind plays tricks. But he wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it, and I knew he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I finished my gin and ordered another. The gin house was filling up now. Dock workers coming off the night shift, prostitutes counting their earnings, a man in the corner who might have been a resurrection man like us or might have been something worse. London's underworld crawling out of its holes to drink away the night's work before crawling back again. I'm going to the anatomy lecture, I said. Jack stared at me. You're what? This afternoon, Wick's lecture. I'm going to watch. Are you mad? They'll never let you in. You're not a medical student. You're not... He stopped, but I heard the rest of the sentence anyway. You're not respectable. You're not clean. You're not anything except a drunk who robs graves for a living. I'll find a way, I said. I need to see. See what, Ned? See them cut up the body we sold them? What good will that do? I couldn't explain it to him. Couldn't explain that I needed to know what happened to Sarah Callworth, needed to witness the end of her story, even if that end was a dissection table and 30 medical students learning where to put their scalpels. Maybe I was hoping I'd see something that would prove she'd been truly dead when we took her. Maybe I was hoping for the opposite. I didn't know anymore. The gin was making everything soft and possible and meaningless all at once. You do what you want, Jack said, standing up. I'm going to sleep. We've got work again tonight. There's a funeral at Bunhill tomorrow morning. Good prospect, according to the notice. 16-year-old boy drowned. Fresh, young, perfect for Wick. He left. I sat in the gin house until noon, drinking steadily, watching the light change outside the grimy windows, thinking about scratching sounds and open eyes and the silver button I'd left in Sarah Callworth's grave. Martha's button, the last piece of her I'd had. At 1:30, I left the gin house and made my way back to Gray's Inn Road. St. Bartholomew's Hospital stood massive and imposing at the end of the street, its anatomy theater in a separate building behind the main wards. That's where Wick would be teaching. He had an arrangement with the hospital, rented their facilities for his private lectures. I couldn't walk through the front entrance, couldn't present myself as a legitimate observer. But I'd spent 3 years learning how to move through London unseen, how to slip through gaps in walls and find unlocked doors, and become invisible in plain sight. The anatomy theater's gallery had a side entrance used by porters and cleaning staff. I waited until a group of medical students went in through the main doors, their voices loud with excitement and nerves, then slipped through the side and up a narrow staircase to the upper gallery. The viewing area was already filling with students, all of them young men in dark coats, clutching notebooks, whispering to each other with the kind of eager dread people feel before witnessing something momentous and terrible. I found a spot in the back corner, half hidden behind a pillar, and looked down at the theater floor below. Sarah Callworth lay on the dissection table, naked now, her body washed clean of the grave mud. The gas lamps blazed bright around her, turning her skin an unnatural yellowish white, making every detail visible. Her eyes were closed. Someone had finally closed them, but I could still see the splinters under her fingernails, dark lines against pale skin that the washing hadn't removed. Dr. Wick stood beside the table in his dissection apron, already stained with old blood that had never quite washed out. He was arranging his instruments, scalpels, bone saws, retractors, probes, laying them out with the precision of a priest preparing for communion. "Gentlemen," he began, and the theater fell silent. "Today we examine the thoracic cavity, with particular attention to the cardiopulmonary system. Our subject is a young female, age 24, deceased of scarlet fever. Note the absence of external trauma or disease markers. An ideal specimen for demonstrating healthy organ structure before pathology has altered the anatomy." He picked up a scalpel, and I felt my stomach clench despite the gin, despite the numbness I'd been cultivating for 3 years. This was different from digging up bodies in the dark. This was bright and public and scientific, and somehow that made it worse. I watched Wick make the first incision, a long line from Sarah's throat to her pelvis, the blade parting skin with a sound I could hear even from the gallery, a wet whisper like tearing silk. The medical students leaned forward, fascinated. Some were taking notes, some just stared. One boy in the front row had gone pale and was gripping the railing hard enough that his knuckles showed white. Wick worked methodically, peeling back layers of skin and fascia, exposing the muscle beneath, then cutting through the sternum with a bone saw that shrieked against the quiet. He was narrating as he worked, explaining every cut, every structure revealed, every anatomical landmark that would appear in their examinations. "Note the intact pleural membrane," he said, pointing with a blood-slick probe. "In cases of consumption or pneumonia, we would see adhesions here, scarring, inflammation. But our subject's lungs are pristine. Death came quickly, as scarlet fever often does. The heart simply stopped." He reached into the open chest cavity and lifted out Sarah Callworth's heart, holding it up for the students to see. It looked impossibly small in his hands, a dark red thing that had once pumped blood through a living girl, that had beaten faster when she laughed or ran or kissed her fiancé, and now was just meat, just educational material worth 2 guineas per student. That's when I noticed her hand. Her right hand, lying at her side on the dissection table. The fingers were moving, just slightly, just a tremor, but moving. Curling inward, then relaxing. Like she was trying to make a fist. Like she was still trying to claw her way out of something. I blinked, certain the gin was finally taking my mind completely. Certain I was seeing things that couldn't be real. But the movement continued. Her index finger scraped against the table surface. Once, twice, 3 times. Scratch, scratch, scratch. None of the medical students seemed to notice. None of them were watching her hands. They were all focused on Wick and the heart he held aloft and the thoracic cavity laid open before them like a map to some terrible country they would all eventually visit. But I saw her fingers moving, saw the scratching motion I'd heard in the grave, and I knew with sudden absolute certainty that Sarah Colworth had been alive when they buried her, alive when we dug her up, perhaps even alive when Wick began his first incision, and now, even now with her chest opened and her heart removed, some part of her was still fighting, still trying to signal that she was here, she was present. She was not just meat on a table, but a person who had died 3 times, once of scarlet fever, once of burial, and once more under the anatomist's knife. I ran from the anatomy theater, stumbling down the narrow stairs with my hand clamped over my mouth to keep from vomiting, bursting out into the gray afternoon light where the rain had finally stopped and London went about its business as if nothing had happened, as if a girl hadn't just been cut open while some part of her still lived. My boots slipped on the wet cobblestones, and I caught myself against a wall, breathing hard, tasting gin and bile at the back of my throat. The rational part of my mind, what little remained after 3 years of drinking and grave robbing, tried to explain what I'd seen. Post-mortem muscle contractions, cadaveric spasm, the body's final reflexes firing as Wick manipulated the internal organs. I'd read about such things in the medical texts Jack sometimes showed me, the ones he'd stolen from his student days. Dead bodies could sit up on mortuary slabs, could groan as gases escaped the lungs, could appear to breathe, to move, to live, when they were nothing but chemical processes running down like a clock unwinding. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew the difference between random spasm and deliberate movement. Sarah Colworth's fingers had been scratching. The same pattern, the same rhythm. 3 times, just as I'd heard in the grave, just as I'd heard at the cart. She'd been trying to tell us something, and we'd sold her to a surgeon who'd cut out her heart while she was still there, still aware, still trapped in a body that wouldn't obey her, wouldn't scream, wouldn't save her. I walked without knowing where I was going, my feet carrying me through streets that blurred together into a maze of gray stone and gray sky and gray despair. I walked past the gin houses where I usually sought refuge, past the churchyards where Jack and I would work tonight if I could stomach it, past everything familiar until I found myself standing outside a building I'd avoided for 4 years. St. Thomas's Hospital, where Martha had ended up, where I'd stood frozen in the corridor while they dissected my wife's face. The hospital porter recognized me, or rather, recognized the type of man I was, the dirt under my nails and the smell of gin and grave dirt that never quite washed away. "No beggars," he said automatically, moving to block the entrance. "I'm looking for records," I said. My voice came out hoarse, barely recognizable. "Medical records, from 4 years ago. A woman named Martha Ludlow. She was brought here for anatomical study." The porter's expression shifted slightly, suspicion giving way to something that might have been pity. "Resurrection Men's wife, are you? Come to see what they did with her." He shook his head. "Records are in the basement, medical library, but they won't let you see them. Not unless you're a doctor or a medical student or," I pressed 2 shillings into his hand, most of what I had left from last night's payment. "I just need to know one thing, just one. When they received her body, was there any indication she'd been alive? Any marks, any evidence of—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The porter looked at the coins, then at my face. Whatever he saw there made him pocket the money and gesture toward a side corridor. "Third door on the left, records room. 5 minutes, no more, and if anyone asks, I never saw you." The records room was a windowless cell lined with filing cabinets and ledgers organized by year and procedure, type. I found 1824 easily enough, found the section marked Anatomical Subjects, Female, and there, written in neat copperplate, was my wife's name. Martha Ludlow, age 37, delivered by Resurrection Men on October 12, 1824, 3 days post-mortem according to the supplier's statement. But underneath, in different handwriting, someone had added a note. Subject showed unusual preservation. Flexibility of limbs suggests possible premature burial. Evidence of trauma to hands consistent with coffin escape attempts. Query: evaluate death certification procedures? The words swam in front of my eyes. Evidence of trauma to hands, coffin escape attempts. They'd known. Someone here had suspected Martha had been buried alive, had clawed at her coffin lid trying to get out, and they'd written a query about death certification procedures, as if that mattered, as if better paperwork could bring her back or undo what had been done to her. I turned to the next entry, and the next, scanning through dozens of anatomical subjects received in 1824 alone, and there, again and again, I found similar notes. Unusual preservation. Limb flexibility suggests recent death. Evidence of post-burial consciousness, fingernail damage, oral trauma consistent with screaming. One entry, dated November 1824, read simply, "Subject regained consciousness during initial examination, administered chloroform, proceeded with scheduled dissection. Regained consciousness during initial examination." They'd known, the doctors had known that some of the bodies resurrection men delivered weren't truly dead. Had known and had proceeded anyway, because the law said that once a person was buried, once they were in the ground, they were legally deceased regardless of their actual state. Had known and had covered it with euphemisms and clinical language and the absolute certainty that medical education justified any means, any cost, any horror. "You shouldn't be in here." The voice came from behind me, and I spun around to find a young man in a medical student's dark coat standing in the doorway. He couldn't have been more than 20, with soft features that hadn't yet hardened into the professional detachment I'd seen on Wick's face. "This is a restricted area, medical personnel only." "Do you know what these records say?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Do you know what's written here?" The student glanced at the open ledger, then back at me. "Those are anatomical procurement records, standard documentation for teaching subjects." "Standard?" I laughed, and the sound came out broken and wrong. "They're records of murder, legal murder. Your teachers receiving bodies that aren't quite dead yet and cutting them open anyway. Because who's going to believe a resurrection man if he says the corpse was still warm?" The student's face had gone pale. "That's not. You're misinterpreting medical terminology. Post-mortem phenomena can appear lifelike, cadaveric spasm, putrefaction gases. I saw a woman's fingers moving today," I interrupted, "on the dissection table, after they'd removed her heart, still scratching, still trying to tell someone she was there." "You're drunk," the student said, but his voice wavered. "You're drunk and you're trespassing." "I'm a resurrection man," I said. "I dig up the bodies you cut apart, and I'll be back in a churchyard tonight digging up another corpse to sell to another doctor who won't ask questions." I was walking toward him now, and he was backing away. But I'll know. Every time. I'll know that I'm not just robbing graves. I'm delivering living people to be vivisected in the name of education. The student turned and ran. I heard him shouting for the porter, for help. I grabbed Martha's record page, tore it from the ledger, and stuffed it inside my coat. Then I ran back through the corridor, out a side door, into an alley that stank of refuse and death. I don't remember getting to Jack's lodging house. Don't remember climbing the stairs to his room on the 3rd floor, pounding on his door until he opened it, bleary-eyed and annoyed. But I remember his face changing as he saw me, as he took in whatever expression I was wearing. And I remember him pulling me inside and closing the door quickly. "Christ, Ned, what happened?" I showed him Martha's record. Watched him read it, watched his face go from confusion to understanding to a sick horror that mirrored what I felt. "This is one record," he said finally. "One case. Could be a mistake." "There were dozens," I said. "I read dozens, Jack, all with similar notes, all suggesting the bodies weren't quite dead. And I saw Sarah Callworth's fingers moving on that dissection table today, after they'd removed her heart." Jack sat down heavily on his narrow bed. "What do you want me to say, Ned? That we're murderers? We already knew that. We just called it resurrection instead of murder because it sounds better. We could stop," I said. He laughed bitter and sharp. "And do what? Go back to being respectable? I'm a disgraced medical student with a gambling debt. You're a drunk gravedigger. This is what we are now. This is all we're good for." "There's a funeral tomorrow," I said. "Bun Hill Cemetery. 16-year-old boy." You said he drowned. Good prospect. Wick will pay £12 for a drowning victim. What if he's not dead? I asked. What if he's in a coma or cataleptic? What if we dig him up and sell him to Wick and he wakes up on a dissection table? Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then that's £12 we wouldn't have otherwise. You can't save them, Ned. They're dead or they're dying or they're poor enough that no one will miss them. Either way, they end up on an anatomy table eventually. Martha wasn't inevitable, I said. Martha died of childbed fever. Whether she died in her bed or in her coffin or on a dissection table, does it really matter? She's gone either way. I hit him. My fist caught him in the jaw, and then we were fighting, grappling on the floor of his miserable room, throwing punches that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with 3 years of accumulated horror finally breaking through. He got me in the ribs. I got him in the mouth, splitting his lip. We fought until we were both exhausted, until we collapsed on opposite sides of the room, breathing hard, bleeding, ruined. I'm going to Bun Hill tomorrow, Jack said finally. With or without you. I need the money. Then you'll go without me, I said. I left and walked back to my room above a tannery. I sat on my bed and pulled out Martha's record page and read it again and again until the words stopped making sense, until the gas lamp burned low and the room fell into darkness. I couldn't save Martha, couldn't save Sarah Callworth, but I could stop. I could refuse to dig up another grave, refuse to deliver another possibly living person to doctors who wouldn't ask questions because medical education was too important to be slowed by ethical concerns. The problem was that stopping meant facing what I'd done without the numbing distance of continued work. Stopping meant admitting that I was complicit in something monstrous. I spent that night thinking about Sarah Callworth's fingers scratching against the dissection table, about Martha's record, evidence of trauma consistent with coffin escape attempts, about how many people had died 3 times, once of disease, once of premature burial, once of medical science. When dawn came, I made my decision. I would go to Bun Hill Cemetery. I would watch Jack dig up the drowned boy. And if I heard scratching, if I saw any sign that the boy was still alive, I would stop Jack, would open the coffin, would pull the boy out and carry him to the nearest hospital. And if I didn't hear scratching, if the boy was truly dead, then I would help Jack load the body onto our cart, would take my £6, would return to the gin house and drink until I couldn't remember. Because Jack was right. This was what we were now. This was all we were good for. And London needed its resurrection men, needed its supply of bodies for medical education, needed people willing to do the terrible work that kept the anatomy schools running. I dressed in my digging clothes, the ones permanently stained with grave mud. I counted my remaining coins, enough for 1 more bottle of gin. Then I left my room, walked down into London's gray morning, and headed toward Bun Hill Cemetery, where a 16-year-old boy lay in fresh earth, waiting to find out whether death was truly the end or just the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. The rain had started again,